Hello and welcome to our Line Opinion panelists this week. I'm Kevin McDonald, executive producer, filling in for Gene Grant, who's under the weather. Happy to be joined by Jessica Onsuras, news director at the Carlsbad Current Argus. Great to see Catherine McGill back with us as always. She is founder and director at New Mexico Black Leadership Council, amongst about half a dozen other things. And welcome back to Line regular Tom Garrity from the Garrity Group PR. Thank you all for being here, and we are starting with one of the most controversial stories circulating right now. Of course, that's the leaked draft opinion that would overturn Roe versus Wade. The Supreme Court's official decision won't be made until June or July, and it still could move in a different direction, but the leak is sparking conversations about what would happen if that ruling were overturned. Abortion access would remain legal in New Mexico because of a 2021 law passed by the state legislature and signed by Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham. Now some other states are scrambling to make a similar move, but it might not be in time. And Tom, just curious, could you have imagined when there was the debate over this bill in 2020 and then 2021, would it actually pass, that it would become so relevant, so prescient, so quickly?
Yeah, definitely, when Senator Kerry Hamblin out of Las Cruces, helped to introduce the legislation back in 2021, I think a lot of people were thinking, okay, it's just more of a political power play than anything else to shore up the bets. And of course, this was right off of the President Biden's victory over former President Trump. And so there was a lot, the anxiety on both sides, and the division was so high that a lot of entities decided that government entities decided they wanted to try and hedge their bets just in case the Supreme Court did something. And lo and behold, the Supreme Court did.
Yeah, and Jessica, you down there in Carlsbad, any cities close to the border are going to be the tip of the spear on this, like a lot of places. There's already talk from Planned Parenthood of Rocky Mountains about adding clinics in border towns. We know if this all plays out as we think it's going to right now, that we will be basically surrounded, minus Colorado, with abortion bans. So there's going to be a lot of influx here, and COVID has laid bare a lot of our healthcare shortage issues. Is there a concern about the strain that you're feeling down there?
Actually, yes. So when we started reporting on what Texas was doing, its moves to ban abortion in that 6-week period, after that 6-week period, there was a lot of talk about seeing the population in need of abortion services move into New Mexico, which was considered, a state friendly to this type of service. But what we started to see really was a bigger question about access. We talk about New Mexico abolishing its 69 Act that would criminalize abortions, but we don't talk about the actual services we have in place now, which, when you think about it, out of the 33 counties in New Mexico, only 3 offer that service, and two of them are in central New Mexico. So we started to dive in a lot when it came to access, and that's just one of the challenges for the state when it comes to abortion services. We're really talking about staffing shortages, about financial challenges, especially for those seeking this type of service. Kathy probably speak to this a whole lot more than I could, but we see disproportionately impacted people of color when it comes to access. So there are still a lot of questions about how New Mexico will weather its neighboring states banning abortion services, Oklahoma included, is my understanding, in the coming year or so.
And Kathy, if you would, yes, please expand on that a little bit more about how this issue is even more of a flashpoint in communities of color, poor communities, and what more you think might be coming our way in terms of legislation around this as we see that strain build up.
So a couple of things for me. I think what I had to come to when we woke up and heard the news about the leak of the majority opinion from the Supreme Court was that life as we know it is no more. And we could have never imagined that something like this would happen, and don't know who leaked the information, but what it has brought back to us is the fact that this is a move perhaps more to states' rights and to fear federalism, and hoping that things will be adjudicated by the states, and all the trigger laws that are in effect just remind me of what we were dealing with in the 1950s and the 1960s about limiting people's rights and having the states be able to choose who could do what. So we know that people of color will be adversely affected. And when people just simply talk about the fact that you now would have to travel to get an abortion, so who has the means to do that? And so it brings into mind all of these morality issues, and, in order to laugh to keep from crying, the meme that was going around about a bunch of dogs, probably mostly male dogs, discussing feline healthcare.
And we, of course, know that there are people here in New Mexico, everywhere, that actually think this is a good thing, and this is all going to carry over into a midterm election. And I'm just curious what you guys think about what impact this issue will have in our midterms coming up. Does it help one party over the other in terms of turnout? Let's just start there. Tom, what do you think?
Well, the topic of abortion is something that really mobilizes the extremes of each of the parties. So progressives definitely a lot more, focused on this as an issue. It will get them out to the polls just in the same way as the religious right or the conservatives are going out for the Republican side. The unintended consequences that I think what we could see is that you will have extremist candidates potentially elected on either side because of the influence of this, potentially landmark case from the Supreme Court. So I think that the impact that we'll see is really more on the primaries, as you said, and we'll really have to see how that impacts the types of candidates that both the Republicans and the Democrats send out into the general primary or general election.
And Jessica, you're obviously down in a more conservative part of the state. What do you think what is this issue in terms of mobilizing to the vote in 2022?
So as you noted, we're in a conservative part of the state. We've got some very red voters in Southeast New Mexico specifically. And what we've seen over the last couple of years is these counties down here already starting to pass resolutions naming their communities pro-life or life-saving communities. And so I think that's a big flag to our Republican candidates out there, that they want to see them take a stance, a stronger stance, and use strong language when it comes to abortion itself. I do know that in the governor's race, right, our front runners, Ron Ketty and Rebecca Dow, have already come out with a statement about how they feel about this whole thing. But I think that voters in southern New Mexico, southeast New Mexico, are really looking for Republican candidates to take this topic back. For it to be a moment for them to really get that message out there in what has been a largely blue state.
And we'll come back to the governor's race in a second, but I just want to stick with you a moment on your congressional representative there, Yvette Herrell, who is kind of done what we're hearing a lot on the national stage in terms of the main messages I have seen are outrage over the leak and not so much about what the decision may be. And just curious, do you see her changing her tactics at all, considering I myself on the west side of Albuquerque will now be voting in that district, right?
Maybe not changing so much as dialing back. I do think that those new lines drawn with redistricting have probably caused her to pause and reconsider how forcefully she wants to approach the issue. But you are right. I think that those newly drawn lines are going to force her to perhaps take a softer stance on the issue if she wants to continue to seek that seat.
And Kathy, back to the governor's race here. As Tom mentioned, this can kind of push candidates to the extremes. How do you see these already a crowded field, one of which the candidates is really a one-issue candidate on this very issue of abortion overturning Roe versus Wade. So what do you see the candidates, and if they go full bore in this mode, can they make their way back into the center at all in a general election?
I think it's going to be challenging. Obviously, people are, as you mentioned earlier, hedging their bets to try to get the pulse of the constituencies. But what we know is that most of the voting public agrees with having Roe v. Wade be the settled law of the land. So, politicians who may be opposite to that, it depends on what they feel their base is, and if it's strong enough to get them over the finish line in a primary situation, they just really have to try to figure out what's the pulse of the people that they are playing to. We know on the Democratic side, they're going to be full bore that we want to keep Roe versus Wade, but for Republican candidates, they're really going to have to hedge their bets.
And just about 15 seconds left, Tom, real quick, what's the bump for Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham in her reelection, being able to point to that law that she got passed last year and that overwhelming support in public opinion polls that Kathy just mentioned for the upholding of Roe versus Wade?
Yeah, clearly for the governor, this is a topic that will motivate her base to get out and vote. And that's probably the biggest bump. The question is, when we get closer to Election Day, how much of this will really still be top of mind for all the voters? Because we've seen so many times how issues can come up within a moment's notice and change the direction of a campaign.
Great. Thank you to all of our line panelists. We'll be back here again in our virtual roundtable in about 10 minutes to talk about the largest wildfire in the country burning right now here in New Mexico.